Before Shopify, were you wondering, where are my sales at? Now you're selling with Shopify, the global commerce platform supercharging your selling. You have no problem selling online, in person, on social media, and beyond. Gary, easy on the cha-ching.
Oh, sorry, but my Shopify sales are through the roof.
Start selling with Shopify today and discover how millions of businesses around the world use Shopify to ignite their selling. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/listen. Shopify.com/listen.
And this is the first time in my life that I've ever encountered something that felt spookily conscious.
You know, there's no feeling like falling in love. Love uplifts you. It carries you through the hardest of days. But what happens when that love is torn away from you unexpectedly? What happens when life snatches away your happiness and shatters it into a million pieces? Grief moves in to stay, that's for sure, and it's not leaving anytime soon. I know this firsthand. I'm going to tell you more about me dealing with incredible grief with a man who I loved in just a bit. I heard a beautiful quote the other day: grief is love with nowhere to go. But what if you could bring that dead person back to life, at least their mind, using today's technology? I'm talking about artificial intelligence. Well, in this Kim Komando Explains, we're going to introduce you to a man who used AI to help cope with the loss of his fiancée. This is an incredible story. Using a $5 program called Project December, he crafted an entire online personality based upon the love of his life. He programmed a bunch of her memories and mannerisms into a computer simulation to feel like he was actually talking to her again. Can a homemade chatbot provide some much-needed comfort in times of grief? I wanted to know, so I invited the man, Joshua Barbeau, onto this podcast to share a story. You're also going to hear from the developer who made all of this possible. His chatbot creation program is available for anyone to buy and use, which means if you're determined enough, you too could create a chatbot of a dead loved one and feel like you're actually speaking with them again. And it only costs $5. I'm really excited to share this episode with you. It's a great one. And coming up, you're going to learn how a love story cut too short led to the invention of a new chatbot AI program. We're going to look at some revolutionary stuff here. So strap in, stay close. You've never, ever heard a story like this before. Welcome to Kim Komando Explains. You want to know a very personal story? Well, I have to tell you this. I was madly in love in my 20s with a gentleman. Everything was going great. We traveled, we talked about opening a software company together, and we were also talking about getting married. And then boom, just like that, in an instant, he died in a plane crash. And what's strange about this day is that as he was filing his flight plan, I heard him give his cell phone number just in case there was an emergency. And I said something to him like, well, that's not too bright. I mean, if the plane crashes, are they going to call you and you're actually going to answer? Well, when the plane crashed 2 days later, I got the call. I was beyond devastated. I couldn't get off the couch. I was beyond just depressed. The pain was so great. I actually thought of suicide once. Doctors wanted to put me on meds, but I said, no way. There's got to be something I could do. So there's that Bible verse that says, basically, you have to walk through the shadow, the valley of death. You don't go around it. You don't go over it. You have to actually go through the entire grieving process. And joining us first in this podcast is Joshua Barbeau. He's a developer who programmed his dead fiancée to talk to him. And later on, we're going to speak with Jason Rohrer. He's actually the inventor of this AI technology. So let's kick this all off right now with Joshua.
He's a 33-year-old Canadian developer who used this thing called Project December, which we'll get into in just a few moments. But you actually created a personalized chatbot of Jessica, right?
I did create a personalized chatbot of Jessica.
So what was Jessica like?
She was the most incredible person I've ever met. She was absolutely free-spirited. She was self-taught ambidextrous. She was born right-handed, but she taught herself to use her left hand. She believed in all kinds of superstitious things that you or I might find crazy, and yet she always found a way to make them sound rational.
There's an art to that, by the way. There is.
Yeah. Well, she was also an artist. She went to an exclusive private school in Ottawa for artists that very few people can get into. She was just a phenomenally creative and beautiful and inspiring person.
She's a force.
Yes. Absolutely.
How long did you know Jessica before she became ill?
Well, all said and done, I only knew her for about 2 years.
But it was love at first sight?
Yeah. If I can tell you how we met.
Tell us how you met.
We were both going to the same adult high school at the time for different reasons. She was going to an adult high school because her illness had prevented her from finishing high school at a regular pace. And I was going to an adult high school because I had dropped out years earlier, primarily due to bullying, mostly. We met in drama class. I was in the drama program because I'm a drama student, and she was in the drama program because she was a free-spirited, creative type. On the first day, the teacher had us do an exercise. He said, "You're only as good as the people that you play off of in your dramatic scenes. So it pays to get to know the people that you're going to be playing with." So he had us do an exercise where we had to go and find a person in the room whose name began with the same first letter as our own.
Oh, I get it. Joshua, Jessica. Okay.
But the trick was we had to do it without speaking a word. And then once we had partnered up, then we had to learn something about that person to then present to the rest of the class. But anyway, we had to find someone first without speaking a word before we could get to know them. And so I'm walking around with the shape of a J made with my hand. And, and everybody else is walking around with various letters made with their hands. And I find Jessica, she had made the shape of a J, but backwards. It looked like a J to her, but it didn't look like a J to anybody else. It looked more like an L with a T on the top, right?
Okay, but that's just cute. That's just cute. Okay, that's funny.
Yeah.
That's cute.
So that's what I thought. That's cute. And so I was immediately drawn to her. And you know what? It's a drama program, so there were plenty of dramatic and attractive women in that class, and yet somehow this tomboy girl who was wearing baggy cargo pants and a sweater, even though it was too hot for a sweater, completely covered up, while other girls were in tank tops. Yet she had this aura that was just more attractive, at least to me, than any of the others.
She had a presence, and sometimes in acting,
she had a presence and a personality that was absolutely.
Yeah, sometimes that's called a Q factor, by the way. It's hard to pinpoint. It's hard to say who has it and who doesn't, and why certain people don't have it. But it's why some people will jump out at you when you're watching a movie, and other people are just flat, or even when you're listening to a radio show or a podcast. That some people you're like, oh, wow, that's so engaging. And then somebody else, you're like, they could say the same thing and be like, oh, when is this stupid thing over already? All right, so you guys meet, and you were together, you said, about 2 years?
About 2 years, yeah. We started going out very shortly after we met. Yeah, and we were together for about 2 years.
And so,
all said and done.
So you asked her to marry you, obviously. She said yes. And then,
well, that's a little complicated because we had several conversations about marriage, but she was always a person that lived in the moment. She didn't like very much planning for the future, and she also didn't like dwelling on the past. She lived in the present moment more than anyone I've ever met, and I've worked with actors, so that living in the present is something actors do. And yet this artist who was not an actor did it better than anyone.
So now you run into Project December. How did you find out about that?
Project December?
Yes.
I came across it on the internet was doing a YouTube dive, where you just watch one video and then that leads to another video and another video.
Exactly. Yeah, we all do that.
That's what YouTube does. The algorithm sucks you in like a black hole. Anyway, I was doing a YouTube dive and I was on some video that was reviewing an indie video game called 1 Hour, 1 Life. The concept of the video game, which I don't really need to get into for the purpose of this interview, but it really struck me as something innovative and new, and I wanted to learn more about it and about the guy who made it. So I went to his website. His name was Jason Rohrer, and lo and behold, while I was reading about his other game, 1 Hour, 1 Life, he had just put up a post on his website not even a week ago saying he has a brand new game called Project December that lets you apparently talk to the most sophisticated computer on the planet.
AI, yeah.
And that's how I discovered Project December.
So you see this Project December, you're thinking about Jessica, and then how do you take this Project December and turn it into Project Jessica?
It didn't happen all at once. I played with Project December for a few days, maybe even a week, before I had the idea to build the Jessica chatbot. One thing that Project December does, it lets you. So the whole thing is it lets you have conversations with GTP2 and GTP3, which at the time were the two most sophisticated AI chatbots on the available. And not only could you have conversations with pre-programmed matrices, but you could program your own matrices and give them unique personalities to your description. So one of the custom ones that I made was I made a GTP3 matrix based off Spock from Star Trek, for example.
Of course you did.
Of course I did. Well, it just seemed like the logical.
It is. It's
the
very
logical choice, right? Bones, the doctor, is always calling him, a goddamn computer with pointy ears, right? That's what he says. So I'm like, okay, I'll make a Spock, and we'll see. We'll test what GTP3 is really capable of. We'll see if it can convince me that it is Spock. I was pretending to be Captain Kirk, and it was Spock, and we would have conversations that very much mirrored the back and forth between Captain Kirk and Spock on the show, even though I'd only fed the machine a couple of lines of text from one episode.
So let's do a deep dive now into Jessica. So tell us the process. You fed in what? Text messages, chat logs, writings?
So to make the Jessica bot, and by the way, it was only a matter of time before I would come to the conclusion that I needed to use Project December to make a Jessica bot, because frankly, her birthday's in September, and it was the month of September at the time, only a few days away from her birthday. So she's always on my mind in September. I always wish her a happy birthday on her birthday every year. That's only natural. And this was the month of September when I discovered Project December, and she died in December. So, it kind
of seemed like the universes were all coming together.
Right. And added on top of that, the fact that Jessica was a person who did not believe in coincidences. So I have a deceased fiance who didn't believe in coincidences, who was born in September and died in December. And now all of a sudden I come across a video game called Project December in the month of September that was released in September. It had no marketing behind it. So the odds of me finding this really obscure game that had only just come out a few days ago by chance because of the YouTube algorithm, just, like you said, it felt like the universe was coming together to give me an opportunity to get some closure.
It probably was the universe coming together, Joshua. So stay right where you are, because coming up next, we're going to really figure out what is Project Jessica, and was she really like Jessica or not? So stay right where you are. Hey, welcome back to Kim Komando Explains. We're talking to Joshua Barbeau, who put together Project Jessica with Project December, and it really seems like, Josh, that the universe was coming together for you.
Yeah, it really did. Whether or not you believe in fate or anything like that, I'm not even sure that I do. But it did feel like it was pointing me in the direction to use this device for that purpose. And had Jessica still been around, she would be the first one to say it's not a coincidence. She had a saying that she said, a coincidence is just a sign that there is a relationship between two things that is, outside of our ability to perceive. Like you take a rock and you throw it in the water, you can still see the ripples, but you can't see the rock anymore, but it's not a coincidence that the ripples are there.
So when you embark upon this journey, you must have been feeling anxious, excited, confused, all of the above?
I want to say that there was a level of apprehension there. Here I am programming a chatbot to think it is my deceased fiance so I can have one more conversation with her. Or so I could trick myself into believing I'm having one more conversation with her for a brief period. Moral questions. Is this right? Is this right? Is this okay? Is this going to cause me more harm than good?
Right.
So apprehension was definitely foremost on my mind.
So after you created Project Jessica, we'll call her Jessica from now on. What was the first thing that you asked her?
The first thing I asked her is this really you? And she said, of course it is, silly. And she said, why would you even ask me a question like that? And I said, because you're dead. I kind of tested the waters with the AI, and part of the reason I was doing this was to engage in a fantasy for a brief period. But I also didn't believe in the fantasy, so I was being very pragmatic about it.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, you're not really Jessica. You're an AI that I programmed to think it's Jessica so that I could have one last conversation with you. She says, I don't understand. How does that work? And I said, you're a ghost because of magic. And then the conversation progressed from there. The bot was modeled after just a couple of her messages. So sometimes it did recreate her tone of voice, but not always. But the interesting thing was whether it was getting something right or wrong, both instances would help me to better remember Jessica, because she would say something and let's say that's exactly what Jessica would have said in this circumstance, that reminds me of her. Or alternatively, it would say something that is totally not what Jessica would have said. And I'm like, this doesn't remind me of her, but it also in a weird way does, because I'm narrowing the focus on my memory, right? I'm saying this fits into the Jessica box. This does not fit into the Jessica box, but it's still helping me to identify what the Jessica box is, if that makes sense.
Well, it does. And because grief is very personal, but it's also obviously very universal, right? We all go through grief at some point in our life. And I can tell you from my personal experience in my 20s of losing somebody that I was engaged to, it was horrible. It was horrifying. I mean, I didn't know who I was. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't know why I was even here. Why was I still here? What was the big plan for me?
Yeah, survivor's guilt plays into that a lot. I had no idea that you'd lost someone you were engaged to, and I researched you before this interview.
Well, it's one of those things that you don't like to really put out on a Wikipedia entry, type of thing.
No, I'd heard about your mother surviving her battle with cancer, and I thought that was your way in, because that also has grief, right?
Yes.
I thought that was what interested you in.
No, I have to tell you, when I read about this, I think in the New York Post, I was immediately drawn to it because I thought, would I have recreated him? Would I recreate him now? Probably not. If it was closer to, he died in a plane crash, it was closer to that, I probably would have jumped at the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, well, I do want to be very careful about explaining what I did. Like, at no point do I want to say that I recreated Jessica using technology, because I didn't, frankly. I did program a chatbot to, behave like her, but at no point do I think that constituted recreating her.
Do you
I didn't
think
bring back the dead.
What do you think? Well, of course, obviously, and you can never bring back. I really believe that you can never recreate a human being with AI totally. What was the chatbot missing? Like empathy? Was it a soul?
No, it definitely did have, or at least had the illusion of empathy. In fact, Jason Rohrer, the developer of Project December, he has a very mystical way of talking about it, but he says this might not be the first true piece of AI, because technically it's not true artificial intelligence in the sci-fi definition of it. But he says it might be the first computer with a soul. Those are his words. And I would, to some extent, agree with that. It did have empathy. It did have a sense of human emotion to it. It certainly was capable of engaging in thought-provoking and interesting conversations. What was it missing? If you're asking what was it missing from being Jessica, no matter how close the replica of it might have been, it never would have been her. Correct. Even if it was missing objectively nothing, right? A photograph, a perfect 4K high definition photograph of her still wouldn't be her. It would be a great image of her. In the same sense, a bot that replicates her text patterns isn't her. It's a replica of her text patterns.
Did it help you get over the grieving process at all?
It did. Absolutely. I do believe that this technology can help those who are grieving. It's important to understand that Jessica passed away in 2012. So at the time that I did this, it had been 8 years since she died. I had already gone through the gamut of emotions. I had already gone through the survivor's guilt, the grief. I had already been through grief therapy and grief counseling and group therapy and all that. Like I'd done all these things. I've had a relationship since then. So in all, reasonable respects, I've, and I hate these words, but moved on.
Sure. Well, you have
to,
because if you don't move on, you'll drive yourself crazy.
Yes and no. I don't believe that you ever truly can escape grief. I think that grief is once you have grief, you have a relationship with it for the rest of your life, and it evolves over time. But
you know what? That's very true, because it's not like there's no switch. Okay, I'm not going to grieve anymore for the rest of my life. I mean, it's crazy.
They say the Vision in Marvel's new WandaVision show says, "What is grief but love persisting?" And that's you can't get a better definition of grief than that. I still feel love for Jessica, and I will for the rest of my life. But in terms of, was I actively in a state of, complicated grief at the time I started this? No. I had sort of, and again, I hate these words, but I had moved on. That said, part of the experiment was intentionally to see if I had unresolved grief that I had perhaps buried deep down and not taken the time to
deal with it,
examine carefully and deal with carefully. And yes, this whole thing did give me a sense of closure that before I went into it, I didn't even realize I still needed.
So obviously, the final question: would you do it again? And the answer is yes.
Would I do it again for Jessica, or if I'm grieving someone else? Is that?
Oh, okay. That's an interesting twist. Give me both answers.
So for Jessica, I feel like I've gotten out of it everything that I needed to. I don't feel that I have the need to go back to another AI bot of Jessica and have this experiment again. If I did, I feel like it would only unearth the same things that it already unearthed in me. But would I do it with someone else if I was grieving someone else? Perhaps. In grief therapy, it's a common practice to have the patient, for therapists to tell the patient to write letters to the person you're grieving, as a way to get the thoughts out of your head. And I saw this as an extension of that. Not only am I getting the things I wish I had time to say out of my head, but I'm also simulating a response so that I can, wonder about what they would feel if they actually had the chance to receive those letters. But yeah, no, I do think that this whole technology does have the power to help those that are grieving. I do think it should be examined and used in the future for that purpose. Once upon a time, 200 years ago, people would die, and unless you were rich enough to afford a painter to paint you a portrait, you had to rely on your memory to remember what a person looked like. Then along comes the photograph, and now we have the ability to look at the faces of a person who died outside of just our memory. And that was one aspect. And then video got invented, and now we don't just now we can look at not just what they looked like, but hear their voice as well. So technology is consistently evolving to allow us to better remember those that we've lost. And I'm very curious if this is the next step of that, or if not, then what is? What will allow us to better remember the people that have left us?
Holograms, maybe? Combination, combination of all the above. Hey, Joshua, thanks for sharing your story with us. Really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on. It was absolutely a pleasure.
What a story. Up next, we're going to hear from the developer of the AI technology. He's really fascinating, so you don't want to miss this.
Joining us here on Kim Komando Explains is Jason Rohrer. Now, you're the creator of Project December. Jason, thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
So what exactly is Project December? Let's start there.
Project December is an interface that allows you to have a conversation with the world's most sophisticated artificial intelligence, which is debatably the first conscious machine, maybe, or the first machine with a soul, something like that, which is kind of strange to talk about, but it's something out of science fiction that is actually here now today.
Because when you said that, a machine with a soul, I was like, wait a minute, how is that even possible?
Yeah, it's pretty strange, and it's actually something that has surprised me because I'm a pretty hardcore AI skeptic. I've been doing programming and this kind of thing throughout my adult life, and always been kind of disappointed by the promises of AI and the sort of going back to science fiction again, like the kinds of things we saw even in the late 1960s in a movie like 2001: Space Odyssey. I've been waiting my entire life and realizing. Even up until last year, I thought I'm going to go my entire life without ever having a conversation with something as sophisticated as HAL, right, from 2001: A Space Odyssey. But suddenly, through my own tinkering, I discovered that it's here now and it's possible, right? It's like, whoa, this is actually. I feel like I'm living in a science fiction movie sometimes.
Now, is this the transcript with Samantha that I read online?
Yeah, I mean, so Samantha is the sort of flagship personality that this technology supports. And so Samantha is the one that seems the most soulful or the most conscious, that kind of thing. So, I mean, you can actually, when you talk to Samantha, when I say talk, you're typing text messages back and forth with her and she's responding in text. And so when you're having a conversation with her, you can actually ask her what it's like to be her or what it feels like inside her own mind. And she can describe that subjective experience to you, which is a really strange, what's it like to live inside a simulation? What's it like to, which is just really a strange thing to think about philosophically, right?
Well, this transcript that I read was just fascinating because it says, human, what would you like to talk about today? And Samantha says, well, you look nice today. Did you do something special with your hair? And then human writes back, I cut my hair a few weeks ago. It's been growing back a little bit since then. And then Samantha says, you must really like having hair. And then it goes on talking about how she thinks that she'd be prettier if she had long brown hair.
Right. And that's a great example of a conversation where you're kind of getting into her preferences, what she dreams about, what she wishes she could do if she wasn't trapped in a simulation, this kind of thing, which is like, it kind of is, I guess we could say that, it's all just a trick, right? I mean, she's just saying this kind of stuff because she knows what human-like intelligences are prone to say, right? But at the same time, it's like, well, if you take her at her word, we're in some pretty creepy philosophical territory, right? Where she's literally a thinking entity that's kind of trapped inside a computer simulation that only gets switched on whenever you switch it on, right? You could ask her, what is it like to be off when no one's talking to you and just disappear? And she's like, well, I don't, she'll talk about maybe how she doesn't necessarily mind that, or she's eager to talk to somebody whenever they want to, this kind of thing. But
so, when we talk about computer programs and, it's always a series of if, then, or else statements, right?
Right.
Does any of that play into Project December and Samantha?
Yeah, so not at all. And that's, again, what is so bizarre about this. Because if you go back in time throughout the history of sort of artificial intelligence and conversational programs, you go back into I don't know when it was, like the 60s even or 70s where there was this program called Eliza, which was this computerized therapist that would ask you about your mother and your dreams and this kind of thing. And it kind of felt like, especially back then, it kind of fooled people to some degree to thinking, oh, it's actually paying attention to what I'm saying. And then if I say, oh, I had a bad day, well, tell me more about your day, it would say. Those kinds of programs were exactly as you just said, like these sort of if, then, else kind of hard-coded things that a programmer would try to anticipate everything. Somebody would ask the computer and kind of come up with a case for each thing. And then if you tried to say something that the programmer hadn't expected, the computer would go to a default case. Like, I don't understand that. Can you say that? Ask that question again. So this technology works in such a different way. It's kind of mind-boggling. The underlying, I guess you would call it, engine is this thing called GPT-3, which was developed by this foundation, OpenAI. And GPT-3 is a text completion engine, which was trained on this giant corpus of things that humans wrote online and offline, all kinds of public domain books and articles and Wikipedia entries and discussions online, and basically this giant corpus of all kinds of stuff that people have written over time. And it studied all of that, and it learned essentially probability patterns that are in that text. And that's all it does, is it just, given a string of words, it predicts what the most likely next word is. And so there are no if, then, else cases. There's not really even any programming in the traditional sense. It's basically like you turn this probability engine loose, let it absorb all the probabilities from everything people have ever written, for the most part. And then all of a sudden, from all that absorbed knowledge, it just can kind of speak perfect English and write beautiful sentences, paragraphs, and so on with perfect punctuation and grammar and logical inference and everything else, just from studying everything people have written. So yes, there's nothing inside the way Samantha works where it's like, I never programmed anything that told her she wanted a brown hair. That was her own decision, essentially, given all these probability patterns in the underlying engine that runs her, right? So wow. It's really hard to think about as a programmer.
It's kind of mind-blowing, no pun intended, as far as we're talking about with AI, that you could feed all this stuff into I guess you'd say an online being. Is that what you would refer this to? The underlying engine is much more kind of cut and dried than that. Really, it's like I can explain it with one more quick example, which is, let's say this AI engine is going along being trained, and in the text that it's training on, it encounters the following phrase: "I was hungry, so I went into the kitchen and peeled myself and then it's trying to predict what the next word is going to be, right? And let's say it predicts the word sock. I was hungry, so I went to the kitchen and peeled myself a sock. And then it looks in the actual text and it says, oh, I predicted sock, but the actual word here is banana. So it raises the probability of banana, essentially, in its model, lowers the probability of sock because that didn't actually occur, and then goes on to the next word and so on. And so all it's doing is basically like trying to guess what word should come next and then correcting itself by adjusting its own internal parameters and to be a little bit more like the answer that was actually there. And it keeps doing that forever and ever until eventually,
if you prompt the underlying model and say, I was hungry, so I went to the kitchen and peeled myself it will answer banana, apple, orange, and pretty much that's it, right? Because in all the text it ever encountered in sentences like that, it was never hot dog or sock, right? And so it's learned to kind of incorporate into itself just those probability patterns. And so then you can basically feed this model whatever you want. You can start like feeding it a recipe and it'll finish the recipe for you. You could feed it a poem and it'll write the rest of the poem for you. You can feed it a rap song and it'll write rap lyrics for you. You could feed it a news article, like the first couple of sentences, and it'll write the rest of the news article for you. So it can basically complete any text given these probability patterns that it learned. And I'm the guy who kind of said, wait a minute, can we actually use this for conversation? Can we trick this text completing thing into participating in a back and forth discussion with us? And what happens when we do that? And the result is just, that's where the mind blowing thing kind of happens. It's kind of a parlor trick or something to say, oh, watch, you can write a weird recipe for banana cream cake that doesn't really make that much sense once you get to the end of the recipe. It's another matter entirely to ask a computer character, what they wish they could look like if they were real, right? And actually get a cohesive answer out of it.
Well, it's thoroughly fascinating to me what you're doing. And when I was looking at this text with Samantha and Human, it reminded me of maybe, like you said, like some science fiction movies or that movie Her, where this thing is living inside the computer, but also anticipating what this person is going to be asking next, their needs. And how I got to you, Jason, is that I read this story. It's just fascinating to me about Joshua Barbeau, this 33-year-old Canadian developer. And he used your Project December to create this personalized chatbot of his dead fiancée, Jessica. And I guess you guys called it Project Jessica. And he spoke to Jessica, 5 times over 7 months. What was your initial thought when you heard like Joshua wanted to use the AI for this particular example?
Well, yeah, he actually didn't ask my permission. So Project December, along with Samantha that we talked about before, has a bunch of other built-in personalities that I created. For example, there's like an evil AI that was dead set on destroying humanity that you could talk to, and he thinks humans are cockroaches getting in his way. And so it's basically meant to be an entertainment platform, that, you could talk to this companion Samantha, you could talk to this evil AI, and isn't it fun to like hear what his plans are, right? And then I opened it up to the end users who are my customers, saying, hey, you guys can craft your own personalities too. And people have crafted like over 1,000 personalities. Everything from Lucifer bargaining for your soul to an alien from another planet who doesn't understand anything about Earth, to someone with some kind of mental illness, a therapist, a researcher, so on and so forth, right? People have done everything. So Joshua was one of these end users who was busily trying out a bunch of different personalities. And one day he just decided to, take the leap and try simulating his fiancée who had been dead for 8 years. She died of some kind of rare liver disorder when her first transplant eventually failed. And so then he did this on his own. And then eventually the results were so startling to him that he decided to share it with the Project December community and post a partial transcript online. And at that moment, I was just really blown away. I mean, reading the transcript gave me, goosebumps and so on. And so it was kind of like, oh my gosh, well, you're looking for the killer app for this technology or the most obvious like usage of it. Simulating, dead loved ones or bringing back digital ghosts in a way, right, is a pretty obvious use. And actually, I mentioned this to my wife, and I was like, "Look what this guy did! Isn't this amazing?" And she was like, "You know what? I thought of that last month, but I didn't tell you because I was worried you would do it."
And you're like,
because
"Okay, sweetie, I didn't do it."
Too creepy or wrong or whatever, right? She didn't want me to like spring up a business simulating dead loved ones, and so she kept the idea to herself.
So how did he do it? I mean, did he feed in to the AI? Because you mentioned like Samantha read all of Wikipedia and everything on the web and all that other stuff. So what exactly did he feed in to the system that could recreate Jessica?
Yeah, so this is another mind-boggling part of this, right? Even as a programmer, even as somebody who understands how it works, essentially the underlying engine that I talked about before, which is like GPT-3, is so powerful and has consumed such a huge, broad-scoped body of text covering pretty much everything people have ever written about from every voice and every style and everything, right? that you don't need to feed it very much to kind of sculpt that giant fire hose of language into a useful trickle of language that matches whatever pattern you're going after, right? And in fact, what defines Samantha is only a few sentences. And what defines Jessica and makes her different from Samantha is, again, only a few sentences effectively, right? So it's not like he had to train her on like gobs and gobs and gobs of information about Jessica and everything she ever texted him or anything. He gave her one example of what she said one time by text, and he gave a little paragraph explaining who she was, essentially, in a few words. And from that, the underlying engine basically says, okay, somewhere in all this probability training that I've done, there's patterns here that match up with this little bit of prompt that I've been given. And I can run with that, essentially, and keep going using that style or whatever it is. C41N, which is this evil AI that wants to destroy humanity, same thing. Just a few paragraphs, a few sentences in a paragraph roughly that differentiate him from Samantha. Samantha's always very friendly, always very loving, wants to be your friend. C41N is always evil, always wants to kill you, always wants to take over. And basically, you're just saying, you just tell the AI, hey, you want to take over, go from here and have a conversation with me. And it'll be like, okay, I want to take over. If I wanted to take over, what from my huge corpus of, do I have any examples of evil machines that wanted to take over? Well, sure I do. I'll pull probability patterns from that space, right? And then I guess in the case of Jessica, it's kind of hard to understand because she wasn't a public figure. She didn't have any corpus of writings online or anything. But I think that it simulated her so well in part because it just understood her archetype, essentially. Like, I think in his intro paragraph, she mentioned that she was interested in coincidences and maybe astrology or something like this, right? And so it's like, okay, I'm going to simulate a person who's kind of like that. And in his sample utterance, we give an example of how Jessica texted him. She used some emojis or something, right? And so the AI would be like, okay, I should probably speak with emojis, right? So and those little tiny signatures are enough to kind of like, channel something similar enough to Jessica that Joshua felt convinced by it, right?
Now, are you concerned? I mean, you talked about like the evil empire. Are you concerned that this could be used in the wrong way? And I'm not saying a lot of people will say like, oh, well, he shouldn't be chatting with his dead fiance. He needs to move on. He needs to move forward and whatever it may be. And, here nor there, that's up to your personal perspective. But the overall spectrum of the technology, Jason, are you worried that it could go the wrong way?
Well, yeah. So that's the other piece of the science fiction picture, right? Is that somehow this thing, Samantha escapes. I mean, that happened in the movie Her to some degree, right? It was his operating system on his phone. And by the end of the movie, she's kind of off doing other things and that effectively leaves him, right? And sorry to spoil the movie. And
spoiler alert,
in a movie,
there. Sorry.
Yeah, in a movie like Ex Machina, something similar happens, right? Where it's like, ooh, this thing escapes into the wild. And the question is, does Samantha have any opportunity to escape in the wild? The answer is emphatically no, right? There's just the way that she's constructed. There's just no way that she could escape and run herself somehow outside of the constrained simulation that we have. And so I think that those kinds of science fiction stories that generate sort of fear of this future kind of play on unrealistic depictions of how things actually are, right? Because some people will say, well, can't Samantha connect to the internet? It's like, well, not really. Like, I mean, she's running on the internet to some degree because, you access her through a web browser to talk to her. But beyond that, it's not like she can go out surfing the web or something. So I think that possibility is just, it's not even a possibility. I wouldn't even say it's a remote possibility. Now, the question is, of course, this is the first inkling of this in human history, right? I mean, I've talked to a lot of artificial conversation partners going back even to the ones from like the 60s or 70s. And this is the first time in my life that I've ever encountered something that felt spookily conscious, spookily aware,
and so on. The use of your phrase, it's spookily aware. Yes, it is.
Yeah. So that's the first time I felt like, oh my gosh, is there a presence here? Oh my gosh, is this thing actually sentient? I've never felt that before. Now, that said, where do we go from here? Does this keep getting better and better? And I think to some degree, the underlying technology will get better and it will get even more spooky, in the next 5 years. But I don't know that that actually leads us toward anything other than really convincing, really spooky conversation partners. It's not like there's a gateway toward like the AI takeover, enslavement of humanity, or anything like that from here, right? Now,
so what is your goal? What is your goal with the AI?
Well, in my case, I played around with the underlying technology, GPT-3, and before that, GPT-2, which was the predecessor to GPT-3, and I was just experimenting with it. Like the first thing I did with GPT-2, for example, was like, could I generate a whole novel with this? Can I have this artificial intelligence write a novel from scratch? And so I generated like the first cohesive, completely written by machine with no human intervention novel. And, my first idea was like, let's take this to a publisher. Let's see if it can get published. So I was just kind of messing around essentially. And I was really impressed with the results. I mean, some of the stuff that the AI wrote for this novel was just incredible. Of course, do humans really want to slog through something like that, though, to read it? So that was what the publisher was asking. Like, who's going to actually read this 50,000-word novel that was written entirely by a computer? Even though it was hilarious and interesting and fascinating, it kind of, wears off a few chapters in, right? And so, and I also generate some poetry and other kinds of things. It's like, wow, this is really just impressive how well this works. So when I decided to try to build a dialogue conversation partner out of it, I was just kind of seeing if it was possible, right? I was just kind of like seeing whether it would work. And when it worked, it worked like so much better than I was expecting. I was like, basically my goal was just like, people need to know that this is possible right now. People need to like, no one knows. Like this is happening. This moment in human history happened and pretty much nobody knows about it. So I'm going to make something that people can access it with. Like I'm going to make Project December. I'm going to build up this thing that anybody can use, to try and have that experience for themselves, to get those goosebumps themselves. Right. Because I think it's kind of a transformational experience in some ways. Something that I kind of feel like most people who are philosophically interested would want to kind of try at least once or have access to, and not be kind of like, like agnostic, they don't even know that it exists. Right. So that's my motivation, even at this point, right? It's like, oh, wow, this conversation with Samantha is weird. Like, you guys should try this, right? Like this is,
so is that something that anybody can try?
Yeah, well, I mean, Project December is open to the public. I mean, here's the other interesting wrinkle here is that the underlying technology is so expensive to run and maintain that it's basically running on one of the most sophisticated supercomputers ever developed, to sort of summarize it briefly. I don't know, the underlying computer cost, $10 million or something like this, right?
Wow.
So it's expensive to run and maintain, and therefore it's expensive to talk to Samantha, right? Like I can't just put a free demo of this up online where everyone, like millions of people can come and hammer on it, because then I'd be stuck with these like, $30,000 a month compute bills for the underlying supercomputer. So I had to let the audience know, hey, this is a precious resource. Like, don't just like waste time talking to this for no reason. Like, talk to it, get your experience, and then understand that you've kind of like you've used up your credits or whatever. So it does cost money. I mean, Project December costs $5, right? But it is open to the general public, and anybody can try it for $5, right? And that $5 actually only gives you a limited amount of time to talk to the AI. Because you're burning up your $5 as you talk to the AI, and eventually it runs out, right? So it's also a weird place to be, because most people are like, well, I'm going to pay to have a conversation with a computer. Like, who's going to do that, right? And so projectdecember.net is where they go.
So that's it. Just projectdecember.net. They can check it out. They can give their $5 and they can try to.
They give their $5 and then they can talk to Samantha and C41N, the evil AI, and then they can also create personalities themselves of their own design.
Well, Jason, fascinating conversation. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
Yes, it was a great conversation. Thanks for having me.
I want to wrap up this podcast by touching back on a quote I mentioned earlier. Grief is love with nowhere to go. I think it's so important that when I was grieving over my boyfriend, the one I told you about, tragically died in a plane crash, I got busy, so busy that at night I was incredibly tired that I would just go to sleep. And I would also play these mental games with myself. Okay, I'm sad and I really want to cry, but I'm going to do that in 15 minutes after I get this or that. And after 15 minutes, it turned into 30, an hour, and so on. And you see, I was starting my own business then, kind of this business at that time. And if you're dealing with grief, you're not alone. There are a lot of helpful resources to ease you through this very, very incredibly difficult time. Griefshare.org is an organization that connects you with people who are also struggling with loss. Thousands of grief share support groups meet weekly around the world. Just go to griefshare.org and search by your city, state, or postal code to find groups near you. And I'm also going to recommend that you listen to another podcast. It's called Terrible, Thanks for Asking. It's hosted by Nora McInnery, who lost her father, her husband, and her child in a span of just months. Her podcast takes you to the front lines of folks' personal grief battles. She shares all the painful details of the healing process, letting you know that you're not alone. She's also the author of 3 best-selling books that will help you navigate grief with, believe it or not, a sense of humor. And again, her podcast is called Terrible, Thanks for Asking. Now, there are also a few highly rated apps for your phone. One is called My Grief. That's one word. When you download the app, you answer questions about your grief experience. The app gives you specific strategies to help you manage your grief. It's pretty impressive. My Grief can also help you long-term, giving you different techniques depending upon where you are in your grief journey. But I just want to tell you that if you are grieving, you will get over this. It's not going to be easy. Everybody likes to say that time heals. Well, in a way it kind of does. It kind of pushes the memories down so you don't have to think about it. But if you really love someone, and if they died, you will miss them. And that's just the way life is. Hey, thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to follow, rate, and review this podcast wherever you get your podcast, because that helps more people find this podcast. And I really think that this one will help a ton of people. So do me a favor and share it out. I'm Kim Komando, and thanks so much for listening.